I want to introduce you briefly, but please expand on what I'll say because you may have any other accent. So Camilo is working with one of the 5 organizations that form the World Bank Group. And in his organization, International Finance Corporation, they mainly mediate credits to development projects from commercial and non-governmental, well, without governmental guarantees. Correct me if I'm wrong.
We work with the private sector. That's the arm of the World Bank Group that works with the private sector.
Okay, then please tell us a bit more about the kind of needs that you would have in terms of modeling and data and the importance or irrelevance for ICT in your work.
Okay, sure. So thank you very much for the invitation. Glad to kind of be talking to you, and very sorry not to be there physically. Going back to the introduction of the institution. So I think this is important for what I want to talk about. The World Bank Group, as you said, has 5 different institutions. The one that is mostly known is what people know as the World Bank, which is the institution that provides loans and technical, let's say, advisory to governments. However, there are other organizations, and the one that I work for is the International Finance Corporation, which, as I said, deals with the private sector instead of governments. So basically, we provide loans. Also, we invest in equity, and we also do everything in the middle, mezzanine combinations, as well as advisory services to private companies across all sectors of the economy. So that's what makes kind of the IFC an interesting organization. We basically operate in basically all sectors of the economy with very, very small exceptions across all the developing world. So the World Bank Group has set, and now I'm going into what we have been doing lately, has set a couple of goals, kind of broad goals for the whole group, the 5 organizations, which are the ending extreme poverty. That's the first one, and has been very kind of with the bank for a long time, with the World Bank Group. But the second one also has to do with inequality. So we call them the twin goals, and they have basically to do with the distribution of income across all the developing world. So having said that, the challenge for the organization that I work at is how does the private sector and fostering investment and economic activity in the private sector would help or not to achieve these two goals. And this is where the modeling comes in. So about 3 years ago, we hired a chief economist who came with the idea that we needed to build models to be able to speak to those goals. And we started the journey of building a model that could basically make this link between private sector development and these distributional goals, if you will. We selected a pilot country that was the Philippines, and we did a second model for Ethiopia more recently. And basically, we put together this model that has kind of several characteristics in terms of economics. For those of you who are economists, it is similar in structure to the computable general equilibrium models in the sense that it represents kind of all the markets. The difference being that we don't necessarily impose the hard constraints of having all markets in equilibrium at all time, because we don't believe that's the case. So that's the first one. We basically take price signals in the economy, and agents kind of react to these price signals, but we don't impose a full equilibrium. And I think the other characteristic of this model is that we try to model the decisions of the private sector, or how many people to to employ and how much to invest, etc. In a kind of in a subtle different way than traditional economics does, trying to represent the way that usually planning cycles in private companies work, where basically you get all the information that you have at the time, but you take some bets, you take some risks, and you don't observe perfectly what's happening in the market. So in that sense, we're doing something different. But what I think what connected me to Leo and you is the fact that this model, to be able to talk about the distribution of income, we have to create basically kind of a population, a synthetic population, if you will, inside the model where we have people, agents. In our case, these are really households with different characteristics in terms of age profiles, education profiles, where are they located in the country, other kinds of skills they have, capital, for those that are maybe owners of companies, and so on. So in doing this model, and this is a simulation model where we want to kind of be able to have different scenarios and observe what happens in the long term with this distribution of income. We had to create this separate demographic module to move the population and to always have kind of a what's the population and what are the characteristics of that population, including the distribution of income among those when they come into the economy and take the jobs that are created by companies and so on. So, so basically that's what we have been doing. I think we have reached a milestone, which is that we're able to make that connection at a broad level. We also were able to create a very specific module for the power generation sector in the Philippines, which is an open market with different technologies. So we are kind of, we can look at the different renewables versus other type of technologies and kind of mimic the way electricity prices are let's say cleared in a market where basically you have different cost curves, if you will. And then we try to do, once we achieve that, I basically decided that why not try to model the financial sector, which I think it's the main topic in this conference, and we started trying. And so the bad news that I have for you is that we haven't reached yet the goal. Other priorities came, and we were kind of really working hard, but I want to talk about that experience because the model was already kind of, it had certain complexity. But as I told to Leo, the issue here was a combination of not having enough information. We talk about big data and all these things, but still, there's a lot of information that we don't have to do this kind of modeling. So let me explain what were we trying to do to model the financial sector. So the first thing is basically we wanted a financial sector that intermediated. So in typical macroeconomic models, let's say the people, the households, will have some savings and those savings will be invested. But usually macro models ignore the financial sector and just take those savings and convert them in investments as if households directly did that. Not all of the households do that. Maybe the entrepreneurs do that, the owners of small companies, but in general, there's a financial sector that does that intermediation. So we wanted to have that intermediation. Of course, we needed to include interest rates and let's say nominal money into these models, which is also hard. Another issue that economists in the room might know is that usually we work in what we call real terms to avoid the issues of nominalities in the economy. But with the financial sector, it's possible not to do that. Now, why were we doing this? Basically, about 40% of IFC's investment portfolio is in banking, and about 80% of the banking business of IFC around the world is basically channeling funds for banks to lend to small and medium companies in the developing world. So that was kind of our end goal, to try to say something about one of our big kind of business lines. So on the other end, we basically needed to model these small and medium companies, and that's where the challenge came, because usually that data is not available. We do have, let's say, some patches of data here and there. There are some countries that have business surveys where you can observe some characteristics of the SMEs, but usually they don't give you the granular data because of confidentiality issues. So you basically have some characteristics, some averages across different cuts of the data. And that's where the challenge came, because with basically the household surveys, give you the granularity of the information at the some at the household level, some at the actually the individuals within the household, some characteristics of them. But here we didn't have that, and that we basically have to calibrate the model under those constraints. So, as I told to Leo, to be able to kind of make take the step forward to do this more complex sector in a model and something that is not typically done in economics, the first hurdle is data. And how to come about it is still a big question. The priorities of my team changed radically, so we basically had to put that on hold, and we haven't made much progress on that. But the other challenge that we have there is that, at least in the countries where we operate, there's a huge informal sector. So this definition of small and medium companies, when you're talking about finance, it's very broad. It's too broad. And distinguishing between which companies are, mostly the smaller ones, which ones are in the formal or in the informal economy, is a challenge. By some estimations, just to give you a figure, by some estimations, in the Philippines, you have between 75 and 80% of people work in the informal sector. Many of those could be like one-person firms, if you will, just surviving, doing some kind of self-employment activity to be able to survive. So all this is the picture of something kind of really complex, but I think that there's a big need to have better models for the financial sector. Hopefully, at some point, we could dedicate some more resources to this initial kind of step forward in trying to make this a reality. But still, I think there's a big hurdle in terms of information, that there are several ways of doing this, trying to calibrate models with synthetic populations that get you to those kind of patches of data that we can observe. And of course, whatever we can get of better information about this, let's say, the more granular private sector. We observe the big companies. You have Bloomberg for the very large companies, or other publications across the world. But for the smaller companies, this is still a challenge. And I think smaller companies are some of them, like a very small subset, is going to be the kind of the crowd from which the corporate sector will get its new companies going up. So how do we understand all this evolution is also very important, to have basically good models and good ways to understand. How do you finance those companies? This is a very broad literature, but I think still data is scarce. And
well, listen, Camilo,
and
if I
that's where
may.
we are. So I think Leo asked me to share my story. This is the story. I hope it was not that boring. But I'm happy to answer some questions if you will.
Excellent.
Thank you.
You see, what's really interesting and important for me is the fact that in your situation, the work on synthetic populations that we are engaged in clearly looks promising. The other thing is that you need complex models to assess the inequality and poverty issues, including the financial sector. And as you say, standard economic models are not very good at this. So thanks for giving us that picture and helping us to think about how we can be useful. I would like to collect a couple of comments from the room here. I think Leo and Guido will have something to say, perhaps others. So you know Leo, you will not see him, but first you will get a question from Franziska, whom you can't see either, which is...
Thank you for sharing your insights. I have two questions. One is, you mentioned the two goals of poverty reduction and inequality reduction, and do you have an environmental goals as well, and therefore do you take them into account in your modeling? So say, I don't know, CO2 emissions or other sort of environmental or climate related metrics. And the other question is, you said that there's little data on SMEs available. What type of data are you looking for, and sort of what is it, sectoral information or technological information, or what type of data would be needed?
I will repeat the question because I am afraid you didn't hear it clearly. If you did hear it clearly, I will not repeat it.
I think I did.
Okay, good. I will collect all the questions so you can treat them as a batch,
sure,
because then we have to move on. So next comes Leo.
Hi, Camilo. So thanks for being here. The question, of course, is forward-looking, and it relates to the fact that assuming that sooner or later you can complete the information retrieval, the complexity of the models you have in mind, how they would require, let's say, high-performance computing, or the kind of computing they would require, what characteristics should have?
Guido?
Well, actually, it's a similar question. In the model that you just explained, which are the range of applicability? I mean, the size, the typical size of population for which you believe this is going to work. In some sense, if it is scalable, if it can work for millions of people, you know, this kind of stuff. Maybe, sorry. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Oh, you come.
I can come here. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Madhav here. It's nice talk. My question related to the use of synthetic populations in Philippines to understand the informal sector and the inequity and poverty. But you also talked about connecting it to the energy markets and modeling framework. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on what sort of connections you see, and what aspects of the synthetic populations would you care about for Philippines?
Well, that was quite a mouthful. I'm sure you can deal with it, so we are listening.
Okay, thank you very much. All very, very good questions. So let me see. I think I capture here everything in my cell phone. On emissions, so definitely that was another of those goals that we had when we initiated this modeling project, was being able to connect all this economic activity to basically climate change. We do actually have some targets. Mostly these are being put out in terms of how much of our business do we want to do in climate change related projects. I think it's don't quote me exactly, please, but I think it's something like a quarter of our business. That's the goal that we have. So definitely the World Bank Group as a whole, and IFC in particular, are being very serious about it. And if you've heard Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank Group, he said it, he will double down on, he wants the bank to double down its activity in this area. Actually, in the present, and I've said a couple of times that the priorities of my team have kind of changed in a significant way. Our CEO in IFC basically has the vision that we need to put much more effort in having assessments of our impacts, of our development impacts, which include environment. So we are now building this framework to assess the impact, again, including environment. And there's a big pressure to be able to model the economic impact, and basically the World Bank group committed itself to include carbon prices in the assessment of projects, and that would also imply being able to assess the net effect. You have the carbon prices to assess the social cost, but what are the social benefits for those industries that have high emissions, and being able to talk about the net effect, and if basically you're willing to take the benefits at the cost, at the social cost of the carbon prices. So that's an area that is growing. I see growing. Fortunately, a couple of people that are working with us have had some experience in this area, and I hope that in the next conference I could tell you a good story about it. We haven't started yet working on it, but I hope that that's one of the things that we have in front of us. So definitely, yes, it was in the plans of that big model, but still there's a lot of pressure, even with simpler assessments to tackle the issue of climate change. On information, and I think the second and the third question, if kind of information am I envisioning we would need for SMEs, and basically is to understand the distribution of companies by different cuts of number of employees. Yes, the technology, definitely by sector. We don't have, let's say, a good sense of how much, let's say, the composition of sectors. If you go and ask in a particular country, maybe they will tell you, yes, there are two or three firms that are big and dominate the market, and then there's all these other kind of small firms that tackle over other sides of the market. But let's say that second assessment is the one that lacks of enough granular data. So what I think would be very useful is to have populations of firms in the same way that we have populations of people, to be able to understand not only kind of the static picture, but also the dynamics. There's a lot of creative destruction, and then some firms move forward, some others are created, and you want that kind of dynamic to, how do you, let's say, how that dynamic takes place, and where do you put your funds, how do you do it? All those are open questions that will, I think the profession hasn't answered yet. So that would be my take on that one. On the size of populations in the model. So basically, with all these kind of breaking down the characteristics of people that we are trying to tackle, we have about 10,000 different types of households in the models. And the challenge here is that is basically something that we calibrate with with household surveys that in general may have somewhere from 25,000 to 40,000 observations, right? Some others are bigger and allow you to make a better assessment. Of course, in these 10,000 households, there are some that really are almost non-existent, and there's a lot of zeros, if you will. So we're interested in the big masses. But still there, I think some of the economists that work under François Bourguignon in the early 2000s were kind of saying the ideal would be to be able to put all those 40,000 or however number of households you have from the household survey in a model, right? And have the full granularity of what you get from the survey and move forward. I think that hasn't been achieved yet. There are some techniques, and at the World Bank, our colleagues at the World Bank have these micro simulation models where they try to exploit that granularity. But basically, that's what we have in this model. And let's say it works in a way, but still, this demographic module that I was talking about is a little bit exogenous to the model. So all these interactions like education, your decisions on how do you educate your kids or pay for education for adults, training, etc. All those are decisions that are endogenous, that have to do with income, and still we are not really capturing that richness of the let's say the portfolio of decisions that individuals and households have to make. Now, on energy markets, just to end it there.
I have to ask you to be quite concise now. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. So basically, energy is an input in all the other activities of the economy, and also households consume energy directly. So what we have is basically the way that market clears the prices. You get the price is set by the highest cost. There are different technologies in the market, and we have a way to model the dynamics of prices. Usually this is all, let's say, the demand varies by the hour. So we have some kind of mechanism to estimate that. But of course, ultimately for the population and for the distributional aspects, whenever the price of energy goes up, that affects a lot the households that consume energy. So it depends on the basket of consumption that you have. You will be affected, and most of all, the households that don't have enough, let's say, income cushion will suffer a lot if they don't have the energy they need. So that's basically how these two are connected, and this is kind of a module. It's like a Lego piece that you can put this detailed module on a sector, or model the sector in a more general way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For me, this was extremely interesting. I'm very familiar with standard economic models. It seems to me there's no ready-made solution to the problems you are telling us, but in this room sit the kind of people who should work on it. So you have set out some challenges, and we will report back to you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.